Tuesday, February 20, 1945, a small village near Augsburg, Bavaria, Germany. Martya clutched her son's hand as the low rumble of engines vibrated through the thin soles of her shoes. The air, already sharp with cold, carried the unfamiliar smell of diesel exhaust. A shudder, not just from the chill, passed through her. Villagers emerged from their hollowed-out homes, ghosts drawn by a sound they both feared and prayed for. Her mind, conditioned by years of propaganda, saw monsters, murderers, men who burned farms.
Yet the trucks rolling into view were not spitting fire. Through the falling snow, the olive-green American convoy moved with deliberate slowness, as if approaching wounded animals. Her son, Emil, looked up at her, eyes wide with a fear she recognized in her own chest, and whispered, "Mama, are they the bad men?" She had no answer. The radio voices from Dr. Goebbels had been so certain, so vivid in their descriptions of American barbarism. But these trucks weren't tanks. They weren't firing.
They were just rolling forward, engines idling, stopping near the village square where the old well stood frozen solid. The world before the trucks. Martya had once known abundance. Before the war, her husband tended their small farm on the outskirts of the village, and their table had never been empty. Potatoes, bread, milk from their own cow, eggs from their chickens. That world had died slowly, then all at once. First, her husband was conscripted for the Eastern Front. His letters stopped coming in late 1944. Then the requisitions began. Food for the front, they said. Food for victory. The cow was taken. The chickens died from cold and neglect. By January 1945, the village was surviving on rations that had fallen below 1,000 calories per day. A single shriveled potato boiled in snow water was a feast. Bread was a memory from another lifetime. Milk was a myth children no longer believed in. Emil, at 7 years old, had known hunger longer than he'd known plenty. His cheeks were hollow, his wrists thin as kindling. Martya's hands were red and raw, cracked from the cold and the constant search for anything edible. The baker's wife had been caught digging through frozen earth for turnips that might have been left from last harvest. There were no cats left in the village. No one asked why. Yet through it all, the radio in the mayor's house crackled with promises. The Endsieg, the final victory, was coming. Secret weapons would turn the tide. The Americans, if they came, would be worse than death. They were decadent barbarians, the propaganda insisted, soldiers of a mongrel nation who shot prisoners and burned villages for sport. They were not men, but monsters, the foot soldiers of a vast conspiracy against the German people. Better to die fighting than to surrender to such creatures. Martya had believed it because she had to. What else was there to believe in? The alternative was admitting that everything, her husband's sacrifice, the years of hunger, the endless fear, had been for nothing. The statistics told a story the propaganda couldn't hide. By early 1945, civilian rations in rural Bavaria had collapsed to less than 1,000 calories per day, while a standard U.S. Army C ration pack contained roughly 3,600 calories. German supply lines, stretched across a shattered continent, could barely move ammunition, let alone food. American supply convoys, backed by the world's largest industrial economy, moved with mechanical efficiency. A Deutsche soldier's pocket might contain a letter to his mother and a half-empty cartridge. An American soldier's pocket held chocolate bars, cigarettes, and often an extra can of something to give away. The disparity wasn't just military, it was existential. Martya had been taught to expect monsters. What she didn't know was that mercy could be more disorienting than cruelty. The arrival. The lead truck came into view through the snow. Time seemed to slow. The dirty, torn American flag fluttered from the antenna. A soldier in the passenger seat raised his hand, not in aggression, not clutching a weapon, but in greeting. A simple wave, as if approaching neighbors rather than conquered enemies. Martya's breath caught. Her grip on Emil's hand tightened until he winced. The truck stopped. The engine idled, clouds of exhaust rising white against the gray sky. The back gate creaked open. Another soldier jumped down, boots crunching in the snow. He was young, impossibly young, his face ruddy from cold beneath his helmet. He looked around at the gathered villagers with an expression Martya couldn't immediately identify. Not hatred, not triumph, something closer to sadness? Then he did something inexplicable. He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a small rectangular tin. With a casual underhand toss, he threw it toward the well. It bounced once on the frozen ground. No one moved. A child, braver or more desperate than the others, darted forward. Small hands picked up the tin, turned it over, studying the English words printed on its side. The child's mother gasped, a sound half strangled in her throat. Real milk, condensed milk. The child ran back to his mother, who clutched the tin to her chest and began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking. The American soldier watched this with that same sad expression, then turned and began unloading more boxes. Martya experienced all 5 senses at once, an assault of reality against expectation. She saw the olive-green paint of the trucks against the white snow, the stencils reading U.S. Army in block letters, the faces of the soldiers, young, tired, their eyes gentle rather than savage. She heard the soldier's voice attempting broken German, keine Waffen, nor Essen. No guns, only food. Then the creak of the truck's back gate opening wider, the quiet thud of wooden crates being handed down, and suddenly the high-pitched squeal of children chasing after a thrown chocolate bar that tumbled through the air like a small brown miracle. The smell hit next. From the opened crates drifted an aroma she could only describe as holy. Coffee, real coffee, its bitter richness cutting through the winter air. Cured meat, sugar. Scents from a world that still had such things in abundance. An American sergeant, older than the others, approached her directly. He carried something olive green and heavy. Without a word, he placed it into her arms. A wool blanket, marked in black stenciled letters, property of the United States. The warmth was immediate and shocking against her frozen skin. The weight of it, the reality of it made her knees weak. "Für das Kind," the sergeant said, his German heavily accented but sincere. "For the child." Emil stared up at the tall soldier with enormous eyes. The sergeant crouched down to the boy's level, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small brown rectangle wrapped in paper printed with unfamiliar words. Chocolate. A Hershey's bar, standard issue for American GIs, containing more calories than Emil's entire daily ration and worth more than gold in a starving village. The sergeant unwrapped one end and broke off a small piece, offering it to the boy. Emil looked to his mother. Martya, her mind spinning with warnings and fears and desperate hope, nodded once. Emil took the chocolate with trembling fingers and placed it in his mouth. His expression transformed. The flavor, rich, sweet, impossibly decadent, was like a memory from another lifetime. He smiled, a wide, disbelieving smile that Martya hadn't seen on her son's face in over a year. That smile broke something inside her, some last barrier of resistance. Yet her internal voice still fought. They said the Americans were beasts, but his eyes were gentle, tired. It must be a trick, a way to make them show themselves. Yet he handed a blanket to her without a word, its warmth real against her frozen arms. Why would monsters bring chocolate for children? Around them, the village had erupted into cautious chaos. Old Frau Weber crossed herself, breathing "Americana," half prayer, half warning. Some villagers ran to hide their last possessions, convinced this was some elaborate prelude to looting. Others clutched their children, uncertain whether to run or stay. But more and more were being drawn forward by the distribution of food, by the sight of wooden crates being opened to reveal tins of meat, bags of flour, cans of vegetables. The child's mother, still weeping, walked forward on unsteady legs. She approached the young soldier who had thrown the milk, held up the tin, and said simply, "Danke, thank you." The soldier's face flushed, and he nodded, then quickly turned away, as if embarrassed by her gratitude. Pride and hunger wrestled quietly inside Martya. Pride said she should refuse, should maintain dignity, should remember that these men were the enemy. Hunger said her son was starving, that dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The blanket in her arms was already the warmest thing she'd felt in months. The question itself was dangerous. What if they really are here to help? The accumulation of impossible truths. The next day, the trucks returned. Private Ray Thompson, 19 years old, from a farm outside Des Moines, Iowa, approached a group of children hovering near the convoy. They watched him with the wary eyes of young animals, ready to bolt. Ray pulled out a Hershey's bar, unwrapped it, and made a show of breaking off a piece and eating it himself. He smiled, chewing dramatically, then offered pieces to the children. One boy, braver than the rest, stepped forward and took a piece. He bit into it, and his face lit up with wonder. Within seconds, the other children swarmed forward, shyness overwhelmed by the primal call of sugar and cocoa. Ray later muttered to his sergeant, "Hell, Sarge, they're just kids, skinny little things. How'd we end up fighting people who can't even feed their kids?" Sergeant Miller, a 35-year-old from Pittsburgh who'd seen action since North Africa, replied quietly, "We didn't fight the kids, Ray. We fought the bastards who starved them." By midday, Sergeant Miller was directing the setup of a small field stove near the village square to boil water for hot cocoa. The U.S. Army field kitchen equipment, portable, efficient, capable of feeding hundreds, stood in stark contrast to the village's single communal pot that usually held nothing but boiled snow. Miller's orders to his men were clear and gentle. "Easy now, they ain't got much left here. Let's not break what little they do." The convoy carried enough powdered milk and cocoa to serve hundreds, while the village hadn't seen real milk in over a year. When the first cups of hot chocolate were distributed, the reaction was almost religious. Old women wept, children laughed. A festive awkwardness began to thaw the frozen tension between conqueror and conquered. Martya watched all of this from her doorway, Emil tucked against her side, both wrapped in the American blanket. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were supposed to be the monsters, the barbarians, the destroyers, yet here was young Ray Thompson, barely older than some of the village boys killed on the Eastern Front, playing an impromptu game of catch with village children using a rolled-up sock because they'd never seen a baseball. 2 days later, transformation accelerated. An American medic set up an aid post near the church. He was a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses, more resembling a village schoolteacher than a soldier. When Old Man Schmidt approached, his frostbitten hands swollen and black at the fingertips, the medic worked with careful precision, cleaning the wounds, applying sulfa powder, and wrapping the hands in clean, sterile gauze that was whiter than anything in the village. Another soldier distributed bars of soap, actual soap that smelled of flowers and cleanliness rather than the harsh lye mixture villagers made from ash and fat. Children discovered that when you rubbed the soap in water, it created bubbles, magical spheres that floated and caught the light. Soon, despite the cold, small hands were creating clouds of iridescent bubbles that drifted across the square, and for the first time in years, the sound of pure, uncomplicated laughter echoed off the stone buildings. A translator accompanied the medic, a private from New York whose parents had emigrated from Munich 2 decades earlier. In perfect German, he repeated to every patient, "No soldiers. Only food, only peace." The Americans had access to penicillin and sulfa drugs, while German civilians were dying from simple infections. The medical disparity was as stark as the food disparity. The U.S. Army could treat wounds that would have been death sentences in the village. During the second visit, the fragile peace was nearly shattered. Herr Kruger, a local party official who'd avoided conscription through political connections, emerged from hiding. He still wore his Volkssturm armband, still carried the ideology that had sustained him through the losing years. He confronted the villagers in the square, his voice shrill with desperation. "Sie vergiften uns mit Freundlichkeit," he shouted. "They poison us with kindness." He kicked over a pot of stew that had been simmering on the American field stove, sending its contents spilling across the frozen ground. "Sie lassen uns betten, dann nehmen sie unseren Stolz." They make us beg, then take our pride. For a moment, no one moved. Then Private Ray, who'd been helping distribute bread, walked over to the spilled stew. He looked at Kruger, at the desperate rage in the man's eyes, at the tattered armband that represented everything that had led to this moment. Ray's face showed not anger, but something closer to pity. He crouched down and began scooping the spilled stew back into the pot with his bare hands, salvaging what he could. Then he stood, looked at Kruger, and said in halting German, "Es tut mir leid. I'm sorry." The apology, unexpected and genuine, did what violence never could. It deflated Kruger's rage like a punctured bladder. He stood there, mouth working soundlessly, then turned and walked away, his armband hanging loose on his arm. That evening, someone reported seeing him tear it off and throw it into the river. His ideology was built on a myth of superiority, now collapsing before the reality that a single pot of American stew was more valuable than his entire worldview. In May, the convoy arrived with news that changed everything and nothing. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The war was over. The villagers' reaction was not cheers but profound silence. The Americans seemed to understand. Sergeant Miller observed to Ray, "Would you be happy if everything you believed in just died?" Millions of Germans were now displaced, in a country with its industrial capacity reduced to less than 20% of its pre-war level. The future was terrifying and uncertain. But at least there was a future now. That evening, Private Ray found Martya near the church. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. He pressed it into her hands with awkward gentleness, mumbled something in English she didn't understand, and walked away before she could respond. Inside were 3 items: a bar of soap that smelled of lavender, a comb made of genuine plastic, and a folded letter written in careful, formal German. The handwriting was feminine and precise. The letter was from Ray's mother in Iowa. It read, "To the German mother. My son writes that you have a boy the same age as my nephew. He writes that you are hungry. He writes that you are afraid. I cannot pretend to understand what you have endured, nor can I forget what your country has done. But the war is over. My son will come home, and your son will grow up. We are both mothers. That is a thing stronger than nations. The war is over. Build again. Teach your children to be kinder than we were. Teach them that mercy is not weakness, and that the greatest victory is the one that requires no graves." A mother in Iowa. Martya read the letter 3 times before she understood it fully. This small, personal act of connection stood against the official Allied policy of non-fraternization, which was proving impossible to enforce in the face of human need. But more than that, it represented something revolutionary. The idea that the gulf between enemy and human could be bridged by the simple recognition that mothers everywhere wanted the same thing for their children. The breaking. The evidence kept coming. Cans of milk. Wool blankets, warm stew, soap that smelled like flowers, and then a letter from an enemy mother, speaking not of vengeance but of children. Each act of kindness was a blow against the wall of propaganda. Each smile from a young American soldier contradicted the image of the monster. The wall of certainty, built over a decade of relentless messaging, developed cracks, then fissures, then collapsed entirely. Martya's internal dialogue became a battlefield, but the radio said they were animals. Yet here was Ray, a boy from Iowa, worrying about his mother, carrying a letter from her to give to a stranger. How could this be? No, impossible. These are the men whose bombs destroyed our cities. But this man, he brought my son milk. He gave us a blanket. He knelt down to Emil's level to offer chocolate with gentle hands. He is not a monster. He is just a tired boy, far from home, following orders to feed people rather than fight them. Then everything was a lie? The conversations around her reflected the same internal struggle. In the early days, she'd heard Old Man Becker insist, "It's a trick. They want to soften us, make us weak." "What kind of trick feeds starving children?" the baker's wife replied, clutching a sack of flour marked with American stencils. "They want to make us dependent, make us forget who we are." Silence. Both knew the only thing making them weak was hunger, and that identity was a poor substitute for bread. Later conversations showed the transformation spreading like spring through frozen ground. After Herr Kruger's outburst and defeat, the dam broke. "They gave my baby milk," one young mother said softly to a gathering near the well. "Real milk." She smiled for the first time in weeks. Another added, "They treated Old Man Schmidt's hands with real medicine. He can use his fingers again." "They play music," a child said, describing how the Americans had set up a small radio one evening and let it play swing music, strange and energetic and somehow hopeful. "The medic stayed late to help Frau Weber's daughter," another voice contributed. "She was in labor. He could have left, but he stayed. Mother and baby both lived." Around them, heads nodded. The transformation was no longer individual but collective. The village was waking from a long, dark dream. For Martya, the final breaking point came during a quiet conversation with Private Ray. They were sitting on the stone wall near the church, watching Emil play with other children in a patch of early spring sunlight.
The children were sharing a single chocolate bar with the solemnity of a religious ritual, breaking it into exact pieces. Martya had been gathering her courage for days. Finally, in halting German mixed with gestures, she asked the question that had been consuming her. Warum? Warum tust du das? Why? Why do you do this? Ray was quiet for a long moment, watching the children. His face showed the exhaustion of a young man who'd seen too much, aged beyond his years. When he answered, it was in English, but his tone made the meaning clear. Then the translator, who'd been passing by, stopped and rendered the words into German. Because my mama would want someone to feed me if I was hungry.
In that moment, the entire concept of enemy dissolved, replaced by the universal reality of mothers and sons. It wasn't a political act, it was a human one. Wars were fought between governments, between ideologies, between abstractions. But peace would be built between people, in small moments, through simple acts of recognition that we are all, fundamentally, the same. Martya understood then. The propaganda hadn't just been lies about American barbarism, it had been lies about everything, about the war, about victory, about what it meant to be strong. Real strength wasn't the ability to endure suffering or inflict it. Real strength was the ability to show mercy to those who had none left. The American convoy wasn't just a delivery of rations, it was an administration of grace. That night, Emil asked her the question that had been on his lips since February. Mama, sind wir noch Feinde? Mama, are we still enemies? Martya looked at the chocolate wrapper her son kept in his pocket, at the blanket that kept them warm, at the letter from Iowa that she'd hidden in her Bible. She thought of Ray's tired smile, of Sergeant Miller's gentle orders, of the medic who'd stayed late for a difficult birth. Ich glaube nicht, she said quietly. I don't think so. Ich glaube, wir sind wieder nur Menschen. I think we're just people again. After the war, by summer, the Americans had transitioned from emergency relief to organized reconstruction. The U.S. Army Civil Affairs units, working with organizations like the Red Cross and UNRRA, began the massive undertaking of rebuilding Germany. Engineers arrived to repair infrastructure. Food distribution became systematic rather than sporadic. Schools reopened. Martya's personal transformation became active participation. When a letter from Allied Command requested volunteers to help distribute food to nearby towns, she signed her name without hesitation. She found herself on the other side, handing bread to other starving mothers, seeing the same disbelief in their eyes that she'd felt in February. She repeated the words Ray had once used, Essen, für ihre Kinder. Eat, for your children. The work was hard, the hours long, but it gave her purpose beyond mere survival. She was no longer just a recipient of mercy, but a distributor of it, a participant in the reconstruction not just of buildings and roads, but of human dignity. Private Ray was rotated home to Iowa in June. Before he left, he found Martya at the distribution center. They didn't share much language, but he pressed something into her hand. A small photograph of his mother standing in front of a white farmhouse, smiling at the camera. On the back, in the same careful handwriting from the letter, was written, Möge Gott euch beide beschützen. May God protect you both. Martya kept that photograph next to the letter, both wrapped carefully in the brown paper the package had come in. The historical assessment would come later. Scholars like Stephen Ambrose would document how the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division performed one of the most remarkable transformations in military history. While official policy had initially been harsh, JCS 1067 called for preventing disease and unrest, but explicitly forbade steps toward German economic rehabilitation. The reality on the ground was different. Commanders like General Eisenhower recognized that preventing mass starvation wasn't just humanitarian, it was essential for stability. You couldn't build a peaceful Europe on a foundation of corpses and grievances. The decision to feed former enemies, to provide medical care, to treat German civilians with basic human dignity, even while the concentration camps were being liberated and the full horror of Nazi crimes was becoming clear, this required a moral strength that went beyond mere military victory. It required the capacity to separate the guilty from the desperate, the architects of evil from its victims and unwilling participants. This act of feeding a former enemy became one of the first unheralded victories of the post-war era. It prevented the kind of festering resentment that had poisoned Europe after World War I. It created the conditions under which reconciliation, however difficult and incomplete, could eventually become possible. 40 years later, in 1985, an elderly Martya sat in her comfortable living room in the rebuilt village, surrounded by grandchildren. The room was warm, the table laden with food, bread, cheese, fruit, more than enough for everyone. Emil, now a middle-aged man with his own children, sat nearby. The grandchildren had asked about the war. They always asked eventually, these children of peace and plenty who couldn't imagine hunger. Martya reached into the drawer of her side table and pulled out a carefully preserved chocolate wrapper, faded and fragile with age, and a photograph of a woman standing in front of a farmhouse in Iowa. This, she said, holding up the chocolate wrapper, was more powerful than any tank. This is when the war truly ended for us, not when the shooting stopped, but when the bread arrived. She told them about February 20, 1945, about the sound of engines in the snow, about young Ray Thompson from Iowa and Sergeant Miller from Pittsburgh, about the letter from an American mother that had crossed an ocean and an ideological gulf to speak the universal language of motherhood. We were taught that they were monsters, she said. We were told they would destroy us. And then they came, and they fed us. They gave us blankets. They treated our sick. They showed mercy when they could have shown vengeance. One grandchild, a girl about Emil's age in 1945, asked, "Why did they help you if you were enemies?" Martya smiled, the same question she'd asked Ray 4 decades earlier. Because, she said, some things are stronger than war. Hunger is hunger. Cold is cold. A mother's love for her child doesn't know national boundaries. They helped us because it was the right thing to do, even when we didn't deserve it. She looked at Emil, who still carried that chocolate wrapper in his wallet, his own lucky charm. He'd gone on to become a teacher, dedicating his life to educating a new generation of German children about the dangers of propaganda and the value of human connection across differences. That American mother wrote me a letter, Martya continued. She said to teach you to be kinder than we were. That became my life's work. Not just raising your father, but trying to be better, to create something good from all that destruction. She held up the photograph of Ray's mother. I never met this woman. I don't know if she's still alive, but her words and her son's actions changed everything. They showed me that the world I'd been taught to believe in was false, and that reality, messy, complicated reality, was so much better. The final lesson. The historical record shows that the U.S. Army distributed millions of tons of food to German civilians in the immediate post-war period. The Marshall Plan would later provide billions of dollars to rebuild Europe. But before the grand policy initiatives, before the historical treaties and the formal reconciliations, there were moments like the one in that Bavarian village in February 1945. Private Ray Thompson probably never knew the full impact of his chocolate bars and his mother's letter. Sergeant Miller didn't realize that his gentle orders would be remembered with reverence decades later. The nameless medic who helped with a difficult birth couldn't have predicted that the mother he saved would name her daughter Grace in honor of what the Americans had shown. These were ordinary men doing what they'd been ordered to do, which happened to coincide with basic human decency. They weren't saints or heroes in their own minds. They were tired soldiers who wanted to go home, following orders that asked them to feed rather than fight, to heal rather than harm. But to Martya, to Emil, to that village and thousands like it, they were the proof that mercy could survive even the most brutal ideology. They were living refutation of the propaganda that had sustained the Nazi regime, that the world was divided into superior and inferior, that might made right, that compassion was weakness. The lesson that Martya carried for the rest of her life, the lesson she passed to her son and her grandchildren, was simple. Peace doesn't begin in treaties. It begins at the table. It begins when you share what you have with someone who has nothing, even if that person was recently your enemy. It begins when you recognize that the person across from you, despite the uniform or the language or the history, is fundamentally the same as you, vulnerable, human, deserving of basic dignity. Years after that winter, Martya would set her table for family meals with particular care. She would make sure there was always more than enough, that no one left hungry, that food was shared freely. Before they ate, she would hold up a piece of bread and say, "This is not just bread. This is a promise that we will be better, that we will teach our children to be kinder than we were." The bread had come from many sources over the years, her own baking, the local bakery, the supermarket in the nearby town. But in her mind, it was always the same bread that Private Ray's mother had sent him, that he had shared with a German woman in a devastated village, the bread that proved mercy could cross any divide. That small, precious act of sharing became a sacrament, proof that even after the greatest of hatreds, the simplest act of breaking bread together could rebuild the world. Would you like me to adjust the narrative focus, expand any particular section, or modify the emotional tone of this historical account?